It was just another early morning at the office. Business had been slow lately. Just a lot in the paper about black crimes. Same old stuff. People were starting to compare everyone to rats. They all have something they gotta hide, and didn't I know it? I'd been working as a private eye for the past 25 years. I'd seen everything there was to see. Or so I thought. I was catching up on some light reading when she burst into my office without knocking, some young girl. She was visibly upset, the typical maiden in distress. I thought I recognized her. She must be the daughter of that old capitalist Henry Dalton, the one with the rich blind wife. I had worked for him on certain occasions before. There was a strange aura to her. It seemed like she wasn't really there, almost transparent. Thought it best to ask her what was wrong.
Sit down, please. May I help you?
Yes, sir. I'm Mary Dalton. My father is Henry Dalton. I need help. Daddy hired a young black man named Bigger to help around the house, and he killed me. I thought I was helping him, and I thought he was nice, but then he killed me. I honestly do not know why he did it. I need to know why. I can't rest until I find out. I need you to help me, will you?
I've heard stories like this before. Ghosts coming back because they never got closure in their life on Earth. Something was bothering them, so they turned around before they reached the light. Of course, I'd never believed these tales, but what could I do with the proof in front of me? Her story was intriguing. I agreed to help.
Oh, thank you, sir, but you can't tell anyone about this. I don't want my parents finding out. They would never forgive me.
I agreed to this condition, and she proceeded to tell me everything that had happened before she came to me.
Well, it was only yesterday that Daddy hired him. His name is Bigger Thomas, and when he came to interview, I simply asked about unions. I didn't mean any harm. Then I said he could drive me to school that night. I thought we were getting along well. When he began driving me, we went to visit my boyfriend Jan, who Daddy doesn't like because he's a communist. Well, Jan and Bigger and I went to a black restaurant to eat, and Bigger wanted to stay in the car, but we made him come along. I thought he needed some friends, so we had some to drink and some to eat, and then we went back to the car. We drove around for a bit, and I suppose I was kind of drunk. We dropped Jan off and then went back home. When we got back, I was having trouble walking up the stairs because I was so drunk, so Bigger helped me. And I don't remember much from there, but I think my mother came in my room after Bigger took me there, and then she tried talking to me, but I suppose Bigger didn't want me to say anything, so he put a pillow to my face. After that, I don't remember anything, just a lot of white light, and then I woke up and came here as quickly as possible. I was supposed to go to the train station this morning with Bigger. I wonder if anyone has noticed I'm missing. Mother and father don't usually wake up for another hour or so. I don't even know what happened to my body after I died.
What an interesting case. A dead girl, a black man, and no one even knew about it yet. With luck, we could make it to the Daltons' house by the time the parents awoke and learn everything from there. I told Mary not to worry. I would investigate from all angles and try to solve this case for her. We drove into Chicago from my office on the outskirts. Interesting place, Chicago in the 1930s. A high level of industrialization, constantly moving and progressing. It was a city of contrasts. White snow on the dirty black ground, mirroring the split of the black people and the white people. Two completely separate societies forced to interact with each other. Often, I knew, black people would try to work against the oppression they were experiencing. There is oppression in every society, always certain people held beneath others. It was a pattern. But no matter what society, the ways in which people tried to escape were very similar. They would go to school, become educated, and be like the whites. Or they would turn to religion and God to save them. But the escape from oppression that most people hear about these days is the violence that comes from the blacks caught between the white and black world, not belonging to either. I had a feeling this was Bigger's situation. The shadows cast by the buildings reflected all the hiding done by the people in society, everyone shading part of their person from others. I had to light up Bigger's shadow and determine why he had killed Mary. Along the way, Mary explained the story in further detail, how she had been friends with Jan for a while, and they were determined to help black people to have a better life. But Bigger had seemed distant, Mary said. He wasn't as excited for the changes as she and Jan were. Mary and Jan must have been trying to help Bigger in the wrong way, and, along with Mr. Dalton's inability to help him, it simply made him more violent. Mary and I went outside of Bigger's apartment and sat in the car. She said that Bigger should be awake by now. From what I could gather, Bigger was not truly awake. He was blind to his situation, blind to what he could do to escape his position. And the more blind a person is, the more power they seem to have. Mrs. Dalton was physically blind, but she was rich, and her husband, blind to the conditions of the tenants with his apartments, was powerful as well. It was dangerous for Bigger to be blind, not for himself, but for all blacks. Mary climbed the fire escape outside, went to look in the window, and said she was sure Bigger and his family wouldn't see her. A few minutes later, Bigger burst out of the door, fuming, and walked down the street. I waited for Mary to climb down. Mary said that Bigger had her purse, and he had some pamphlets that Jan had given him, as well as a bloody knife. Mary said she knew it was her blood. His crime seemed natural. He felt that all of his life he had been leading to something like this. The family had woken up, and his sister had kept asking him about the job. She seemed to think there was something wrong with him, and his mom had agreed, saying, "That boy ain't got no sense." Didn't really seem like a mother to me. The sister was very bothered, telling Bigger to quit looking at her and complaining to her mother. They seemed like two people with the same brain, I thought. Bigger and his brother and his mom were talking about the time a lot, saying Bigger got home last night at different hours. Bigger's brother was talking to him about some girl named Bessie who had come to visit him. Must have been his girlfriend. Bigger had asked for money from his mother, and she had given him a $50, saying, "That leaves me exactly $1 to last till Wednesday." So this was a poor family, crushed under poverty because of white people taking away their opportunities. No wonder Bigger had killed Mary. He seemed to have a lot of anger in him for someone so young. All that anger was probably directed towards white people. He must have felt this race was displaced because of them. This reminded me of a poem I had read, written by Claude McKay in 1921, entitled, "Enslaved. My heart grows sick with hate, becomes as lead, for this my race that has no home on earth." Maybe the only way he could escape it was through violence. Mary said that Bigger got up to leave and dropped a roll of money on the floor, money that had been from her purse. As Bigger was leaving in a rush, annoyed with his mother and sister, his brother, who seemed to be his steadfast compadre, had run after him with a roll of money. We continued to drive and follow Bigger. He went to the drugstore and we sat outside, watching him buy cigarettes for his friends. They seemed surprised. Bigger must not act like this often. I suppose he treats them poorly with all his anger. He seems like a prideful fellow. That was probably his greatest fear, the fear of his life being exposed to his friends. Bigger's friend had even said, "Bigger, you sure is crazy." He seems estranged from his own race, estranged from the world. Sitting on the fence between the black and white societies, Bigger left the drugstore. We continued to follow him. He seemed happy. It was his first time without being fearful, after the whites had frightened him for his whole life, controlling his actions. He boarded a streetcar and made his way to Mary's house. Thought it was curious he decided to do that instead of leaving town. He went inside the Daltons' house, and we followed him. Mary knew a spot to sneak into her house, so we snuck in, hiding behind doors and listening to conversations. We stood outside a door to the furnace room. Peggy was in there, and Bigger walked in. They were talking about the furnace. Peggy said, "The fire was very hot last night," and Bigger said he would fix it. Could Bigger have burned Mary? It seemed violent, but if he had used the knife on her, I wouldn't put it past him. Besides, her body had not turned up elsewhere as of yet. Peggy asked about Mary, asked if Miss Dalton had come yet, and Bigger said no. So it seemed he was going to make up a story about what had happened last night, try to cover his tracks instead of running. He seemed very content with his life at this point, although he had all the reason not to be. Peggy told Bigger not to forget the trunk. He went upstairs and Mary and I followed him. He put the pamphlets in a pile on his desk, then he took the trunk out to the car, hiding the fact that he knew Mary would never come out. Bigger told Peggy he simply was doing what he was told. He also told her that Jan was with them last night when Bigger left. Mary told me that wasn't true. Said Bigger and her were alone and that they had dropped Jan off at his apartment earlier in the night. Bigger got in the car and we followed him to the train station. Seemed it would be an easy enough way for him to escape, but he instead turned around and went to Dalton's house after dropping off the trunk. Back at the house, Bigger ate breakfast. Seemed to have difficulty eating, probably because of his conscience. Then someone called. Turned out to be that Jan fellow, Mary's boyfriend, and he was wondering if Mary got off to Detroit all night. Bigger went downstairs to the furnace room, then back up to his room, and lay down on his bed. We hid outside the door. He could hear Mrs. Dalton and Peggy talking in the kitchen. We heard them talking about where Mary might be. Mrs. Dalton was worried because she didn't even leave a note. Peggy told her about Mary being with Jan, to which Mrs. Dalton said, "She just won't leave those awful people alone," talking about the communists, I suppose. Peggy told her about his call this morning and how Jan was upset that Mary was gone, but Peggy thought Mary had Jan call, so Mary could know if they knew she was gone or not. Mrs. Dalton told Peggy that she was drunk last night. Too drunk to talk, she said. So Bigger had smothered her when she tried to talk. Didn't want Mary giving away his presents to her mother. She would not approve. Mrs. Dalton went to Mary's room and then went downstairs, telling Peggy something is wrong because Mary didn't pack everything she had intended in the trunk. Mrs. Dalton told Peggy to have Bigger sent to talk to her. Bigger went to sleep, and Mary and I were able to take some time to discuss what we had learned. Funny thing about the name Dalton, it actually means blind. So while Bigger is blind to his own situation and the repercussions that will occur, even though he thinks he can see everything, the Daltons are also blind. This represents all people in a way. They are blind to the situations of others. This must be the cause of oppression, not being able to understand others. Whites think that blacks are inherently violent. It is their collective unconsciousness. This stems from ignorance, and the oppression that it contributes to is the cause for fear and anger inside Bigger. From what it seems, he has never experienced love, not from his family or friends or anyone. This would be his personal unconscious, and is likely the reasoning behind his violence. Bigger is trying to hide his true self with a shadow, which everyone does. We all have parts of us that we don't want exposed, that we don't even want to have. This is the rat inside of us. Bigger's greatest fear must be this exposure, but he will be forced to face it eventually. Bigger seems most content when left alone. A teleological part of his personality would be acting aggressively to get people to leave him alone, not only whites, but his family as well. Which was made obvious to me when Mary said that Bigger had asked his mother what she was starting a fuss for after she was simply asking him questions about the job, and later storming out when Vera was talking to him. Bigger was angry at the world. He was angry and fearful. But we still did not know the reason he killed Mary of all people. Sure, it could be because she had made him feel uncomfortable when she made him eat, and later when he was drunk. But so far, the murder seemed like an accident. At this point, I was not sure it had any reasoning behind it. Why should the murder mean anything, and why should it have an effect on society? It was nothing. People are born and die every day. Why should this death matter? We would have to continue following Bigger's life. At 3, Mary's mother went to talk to Bigger. He hadn't heard Peggy ringing. She asked him about the trunk in the car. Bigger told her that Mary told him to keep the car outside overnight and that Jan had gone to Mary's room with her, which must have been a new development Bigger put in the story so that Mrs. Dalton would accuse Jan of being responsible for Mary missing and not him. Mrs. Dalton left Bigger alone and Bigger left the house. We followed him to a rundown apartment and Mary again went to see what was happening. Bigger was with a girl he called Bessie, his apparent girlfriend. She was his escape from the actual world, could make him forget about what he had really done. She's complaining about him being distant for a while, saying that he stayed away so long and that he is acting cold. He is not warm towards anyone in his life. It seems that Bigger only seeks Bessie for pleasure, for his needs. Bessie then mentioned the Lieb and Leopold case and how it occurred on the same street as Bigger works. Bigger got an idea. He was excited now, and Bessie begged him to tell her what was on his mind. He told her that Mary ran off with Jan and that they could put up a ransom note to get money and benefit off Mary being gone. Bessie was unsure, but Bigger forced her to go along with him, saying, "You going to help me? Say yes or no." Bessie was still unsure. Bigger was feeling more alive than he had ever remembered feeling. His mind and attention were pointed, focused toward a goal. He knew that if he focused, he had the opportunity to be fulfilled and escape the death he knew he would face if he was caught. His oppression would be more than he had ever known if they discovered he killed Mary. Bigger walked from the sidewalk down the driveway at the Daltons and went directly to the basement to peer into the furnace. Feeling the draft, he added more coal but noticed the ashes had piled up. He would need to clean out the ashes later. Peggy entered and asked Bigger to go to the station to pick up Mary's trunk that was never claimed because Mary never got there. Everyone in the house was going crazy looking for Mary, wondering where she could be. Bigger explained to Peggy that he took the trunk as it was and put it where she saw it downstairs that very morning. Upon getting the trunk from the station, Bigger realized that he needed to send the ransom note before Jan's name was cleared from the investigation. In the ransom note, he asked for $10,000 to be placed in a shoebox and have it dropped off at the curb where a flashlight would be flickering from the window. As soon as Bigger got back to the Dalton home with Mary's trunk, he was introduced to Mr. Britton, an investigator who was helping with the Mary situation. He at first believed Bigger was to blame, questioning him aggressively solely because he is black. It was predetermined that this would happen simply because of ideas that whites had of blacks and their misconceptions. Bigger had no hand in determining whether this would happen or not. It would not have mattered if he was innocent or not. He asked Bigger to relay the story of what happened the prior evening. Bigger admitted that he did not take Mary to the university, but to the Loop, where they met Jan. Feeling like he had the upper hand in the investigation, Bigger felt more in control than ever. He also told Mr. Britton that they all went to the Ernie's, where they ate, got drunk, and Jan talked a lot about the Communist Party. To this, Mr. Britton questioned that Bigger could be a part of the Communist Party because of the pamphlets found in his room. Mr. Dalton intervened and assured him that Bigger was telling the truth. Bigger realized that Mr. Dalton was the good guy and Mr. Britton was the enemy. Bigger went up to his room to take a nap, but had a dream. Out of the surrounding silence and darkness came the quiet ringing of a distant church bell, thin, faint, but clear. It tolled, soft and loud, then still louder, so loud that he wondered where it was. Suddenly, Bigger felt that the bell was more of a warning to run. Bigger saw a fiery light coming from a furnace, and he had a package in his hands that he could barely hold on to. He opened the package and he saw his own severed head. Bigger's unconscious was foreshadowing that he would soon be caught and have to face his fears. Feeling more frightened than ever, he threw his head into a mob of people around him. Bigger woke up to realize that he was subconsciously hearing the calling bell ringing. When he opened his door, Jan and Britton entered his room to confront him about his lying, but Bigger won't talk to Jan, only Mr. Dalton and Britton. Mr. Dalton stepped in to be the rational one in the situation. All they wanted was to find Mary. At this, Bigger realized he must see Bessie right away to send the ransom note. Bigger used Bessie as his crutch for both physical and emotional support. The relationship was based more on Bigger's sexual desires, and Bessie was in the relationship for her own desires. On his way to Bessie's, Bigger saw Jan outside of a store. Feeling threatened, Bigger pulled out his gun and scared Jan away. While he said, "For God's sake, man, what are you doing? Don't shoot. I haven't bothered you. Don't." Jan fled the scene, leaving Bigger to go into the store to buy paper, an envelope, and a pencil for the letter. We followed Bigger back to Bessie's apartment. Bessie wanted to back out of the deal that Bigger had proposed. This was a bad idea for Bessie, considering Bigger's violent history and his obvious lack of care for her. She kept asking him, "Where's that girl?" and Bigger finally let her know that he killed the girl. He told Bessie that she was in it as deep as him. Poor Bessie. Bigger said that he ain't going to leave her behind to snitch. And with this, he took her away with her free will. Contributing to naturalism in that situation was involved in destroying her freedom to decide. Women seemed to be dominated by men in Bigger's life. They seemed to be insignificant. Bigger forced Bessie to drink, and he told her how they would go about dropping off the ransom note and collecting the money. We followed him to the Dalton's house and saw him drop off the ransom note underneath the door. No one had seen him. Bigger went inside and lied in bed, cold and hungry. He got up to cover the trace of the letter by throwing the gloves, pencil, and paper into the furnace. He then went to the kitchen to find her some dinner, and Peggy came in and said that his dinner had been ready since 5. Bigger noticed something in her hand, the ransom letter. At this, Bigger could not concentrate on finishing his dinner. Peggy went upstairs to show his letter to Mr. Dalton. Instead of leaving, Bigger wanted to stay to see what the outcome of the situation would be. He knew that he had the choice to stay or run away, and being able to do what he wanted made him feel free. Bigger overheard Mr. Dalton and Britton. They talked about the letter and learned that Mr. Dalton would pay the money for the ransom to get his daughter back. They both believed that the communists were asking for the money. Britton thought Jan was to blame. Newspaper journalists had arrived at the house, showing Britton the already printed papers with the news of Mary missing on them. Mr. Dalton had begun to make a statement for the papers that he believed would help Mary when Mrs. Dalton entered. Mary's white cat bounced down the steps and leaped with one movement upon Bigger's shoulder and sat perched there. The cat pointed him out, seemingly telling the world what he had done before. It represented the guilt and accusation that identified him as Mary's killer. Britton questioned Bigger about Jan and about their drunkenness. Peggy told Bigger there was not enough heat, and that he must clean out the ashes. The ashes are Bigger's preconscious, his memories that had caused him anger. The fire, his anger and fear, it had died down after he killed Mary. The coal is the current occurrences in Bigger's life making him angry. The threat of discovery was the smoke, slowly building and becoming more and more threatening. Bigger did not dare revisit his ashes, his memory, while all the men were around. The air, Bigger's escape path, is cut off and can no longer get through the furnace. The smoke billows out of the furnace, and the threat of discovery becomes too large. Bigger will be found out. As McKay's enslaved poem goes, "The white man's world of wonders utterly, let it be swallowed up in earth's vast womb, or upward roll as sacrificial smoke, to liberate my people from its yoke." But Bigger will not be liberated. He is the sacrifice going up in smoke. One of Britton's men cleared out the ashes. He stared into them. "It's bone," he said. So Bigger had burned Mary. Now that this was found out, it was clear Bigger would soon be caught. He tiptoed away from the scene and ran. It was snowing now, hard. It added to Bigger's confusion and the chaos caused by both his actions and the events in his life that forced him to act this way. It was cold and white, as the whites were also, apathetic towards the plight of black people. He made his way to Bessie's house and told her it's off. She was happy for a moment, but then he told her that they would soon be after him, and she became terrified. Bessie cried and Bigger dragged her into the snow, to a rundown apartment building, and they climbed into her room through the window. He and Bessie laid down, and she fell asleep. Bigger went to the corner of the room, picked up a brick, and repeatedly hit Bessie's head, killing her. He could not escape with her holding him back. He was forced to do this. The circumstances had taken away any free will he ever had. He threw her body down an air shaft. This murder was a major development. I could now identify Bigger's relationship with ego and superego. He knew the best thing, the ideal thing, was to leave Bessie alone. It would benefit her the most. This was his superego. His idea was to kill Bessie and get rid of all his problems involving her. His ego, the compromise between the two, would have been to bring her along. But his idea won in this case, and the result was a dead Bessie. Naturalism is an extreme form of realism, his true self being exposed with taking him over. This was the second most meaningful thing in his life, the first being the murder of Mary. So murders gave his life meaning. He felt he was acting against his oppression by both races. However, he could not run forever, and his murder of Bessie would not help him escape. Bigger was on the run, in fear that the Daltons knew that he put Mary's body in the furnace. He came across a newspaper article. Reporters find Dalton's girl bones in a furnace. Negro chauffeur disappears. 5,000 police surround Black Belt. Bigger left the apartment and fled to the rooftops through a trap door. Heart pounding, fear flooded Bigger as he was coming closer to his end. Using his gun as a weapon, he was able to defend himself, but only momentarily. Bigger was being hunted like a rat by a white cat of guilt and accusation. They were looking for him in every building and on every floor and on every room. Bigger took refuge on top of a building with a trapdoor. Holding his gun, he waited to see if the trapdoor would open. When it did, a man came onto the roof facing the opposite direction. Bigger used the gun to hit the man in the skull. As he fell, people called for him, and several men soon emerged. He was frozen on the rooftop. The police were yelling at him to throw down his gun. He couldn't. He was too cold and powerless. This is simply a representation of every black person in the white world. Completely surrounded by their cold white presence like the snow, stopping them and forcing them to surrender any glimpse of power they might have had. Bigger had murdered Mary, but he had murdered his own future in the process. His two murders had been the most meaningful things in his life. He had actually felt like he was acting consciously, like he was awake and could choose what to do. He had killed Mary for power and killed Bessie so she didn't restrain his power. He thought his violence would make him powerful. He was wrong. Bigger was a tragic hero, but he was not rich or of noble birth. He was working to help fix his oppression, and his pride and fear were his fatal flaws. He had reached his peripeteia, being caught by the whites. His entire existence had simply been a series of defense mechanisms he employed towards the oppression. He displaced his anger towards white people by killing Mary, an innocent white girl. He rationalized his actions by deciding that it was Mary's fault, since she made him uncomfortable during his interview, and again he hated her later when she was drunk and he was forced to drag her up the stairs. His reaction formation was acting like he did nothing and blaming Jan in order to avoid getting caught. He regressed when he went to Bessie's house to use her to make him feel better by meeting up with his friends who he had decided not to be involved with anymore. Repression occurred when he avoided acknowledging what he did, but his dreams prevented him from this step. He killed Bessie because she reminded him too much about what he did, as she constantly brought it up. Finally, his denial was running away from the police and therefore his problem. Bigger had been caught. His world was ended.
This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper.